Hey everyone. So for today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the 1980s and 1990s in American history and culture. This can be really looked at as the me generation. This is when entertainment, lifestyles, and just options become more personalized in a lot of ways. You begin to see TV have way more channels, more movies. You begin to see video games. You see the creation of the internet. And this really leads up to a lot of things that we see in our culture today. So some of the role models of the 1980s and 1990s could be Oprah Winfrey and Bill Gates. Oprah Winfrey started her talk show in the 1980s and became wildly popular throughout the 1990s, becoming one of the most wealthy and powerful women in the world. Bill Gates became the richest man in the world in the 1990s after the company he created, Microsoft, became the most powerful computing company in the world. So you kind of see the growth of this wealth, people becoming extremely rich in entertainment and computers. Two TV shows that sum up the culture of this time are Miami Vice and Baywatch. These are action TV shows, adventure shows. Baywatch was in the 1990s, Miami Vice was in the 80s, and they featured attractive people in exotic locations, having adventures, living dangerously, and kind of showed how TV had changed and kind of what the values of the time were. In the 1980s, you have African Americans becoming more prominent and having some of the most popular TV shows of the decade. A show like Different Strokes featured an African American family and a white family. So it just kind of showed the differences in culture between that and kind of examined that. The Cosby Show was one of the most popular shows of the 1980s, and it showed an African American family. That traditional family that we might have seen in the 1950s with a show like Leave It to Beaver, we now see as an African American family in the 1980s. Two of the most popular shows in the 1990s represent different looks at sitcoms or of comedies. You have a show like Friends, which represents six single friends living in New York City, trying to figure out what they're going to do with their lives. You have a show like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which is about a young African-American man, Will Smith, who moves in with a rich family, but he represents hip-hop culture, represents changes that are happening in society. Action movies are really important in the 1980s, and they kind of represent the idea of good versus evil that was popular during the Cold War, the idea of a good American soldier taking on an evil empire. So you have stuff like Rambo, where Sylvester Stallone plays John Rambo, who takes on armies by himself. You have movies like Top Gun, which is about American fighter pilots fighting. So these really represent the idea of good versus evil, of Cold War, flashy, big action movies. As we'll see, technology becomes more prevalent during the 1980s and 1990s. It moves into the house with personal computers, the internet, things like that, and you begin to see that represented in cinema, in particular in dystopian future, and the idea that technology is going to run amok and take over our lives. You see that with movies like The Terminator in the 1980s or The Matrix in the 1990s. These are really popular sci-fi action movies, but they represent the problem of machines. So this is kind of an underlying fear that people have in society as technology becomes more prevalent in everyday life. A huge thing that changes in the 1980s is the introduction of a new music form known as hip hop or rap music. Rap is popularized in the 1980s. It builds out of New York City, then spreads throughout the country. And hip hop is now the most popular music in the world. One thing about hip hop, it is very expressive. It expresses individuality, expresses people's culture. And what you begin to see in hip hop culture is people representing ideas, representing things counter to the mainstream culture. It's representing ideas such as like gangster culture in South Central Los Angeles with NWA, or Wu-Tang representing like a gangster culture in New York City. So you have kind of this underground movements, but selling it to the masses, the idea of telling these stories of people who have been underrepresented in society. So hip hop becomes a really important art form. Beginning in the 1980s, becomes incredibly popular in the 1990s, and is the most popular music in the world today. One of the biggest advancements in technology in the 1980s is the personalized video game system. That is a video game system that you could bring into your house and play on your own. So before you had to go to an arcade, you had to put quarters into a giant machine to play a video game. Now you could bring in what you see there in the top right corner, that is the Atari 2600. Bring that in and play a game like Pitfall there on your TV. Video games continue to improve throughout the 1980s and 1990s and are a big part of culture. and lead to what we see today. Video game culture is huge. Not only did video games move into the home, computers do as well. Again, computers used to be huge mainframe computers that were either at a government building, they might be at a research institution, at a university, but in the 1980s, what is known as the personal computer comes into the house and you're able to have a computer in your house to work on. You can see here the Macintosh SE and the iMac. These were both popular computers in the 1980s and then in the 1990s. And you can see they had a whopping 128 kilobytes of memory, which is nothing today, but this is a huge advancement. This is when we begin to become more individualized. We get to have these machines in our houses for entertainment and for work. Maybe the biggest advancement that happens during these 2 decades is the internet is born. In the 1980s, the internet was used by universities to kind of trade information, to send research information back and forth. But in 1990, it is brought available for the consumers. And this goes increasingly popular throughout the 1990s. People begin to connect to the internet with their personal computers and connect to the world. One of the big advancements that allows people to use personal computers is the creation of graphical user interface, or GUI. One of the most popular programs that does this is Microsoft Windows. This is how Microsoft becomes so powerful, becomes so profitable, and Bill Gates becomes the richest man in the world in the 1990s. A graphical user interface is basically what you see when you look at a computer. So rather than see lines of code or see kind of that old school computer with the green type and you have to type in commands, what that is allows us to manipulate a computer, to use a computer, and you have a graphic face that you click on. So you click on an OK, a cancel, rather than type commands directly into the computer. This is the interface that we use today on computers. Again, Microsoft Windows is still the program that we use. This came out in the early 90s. This is what you see on your cell phones. You see anything. So this is what becomes popular and allows people to use computers. The idea of mail changes in the 1990s. So before, mail would have been a letter, maybe a package you got from the post office. The term email becomes popular. Electronic mail becomes a popular form of communication in the 1990s as people are using those personal computers that they have in their house to send messages back and forth with a program like America Online. And today, email is the most popular form of communication in the world. TV is also changing. Entertainment options are changing. So before, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you would have an antenna. You would put an antenna on top of your house. You would get a broadcast, and that usually consisted of 3, maybe 4 channels that you could watch. In the 1970s and then in the 1980s, it becomes incredibly popular, the use of cable television. Cable is that cable you see, goes into your house, and what cable offers is a wide variety of channels. Offers at first maybe 60 channels to where today you have hundreds of channels on demand. So rather than have 3 choices with an antenna, in the 1980s you begin to see cable TV, and people have so many more choices of what they can watch on TV. And again, that's kind of the me generation. So you're able to watch what you want to watch. You don't have to watch the same shows that everybody else is. You have a personal computer. You're able to do all these things. Music too becomes personalized in the 1980s and 1990s. So you have the creation of the boombox or the portable radio. You can see this guy with his sweet hair carrying a radio around. Music can move with you. You don't have to have a giant radio that you listen to in your house. You don't have to have it plugged in. You can put batteries in and go anywhere. And then in the 1990s, you have the creation of the MP3 player. That is digital files. You download music to these and take it with you. And so the idea is that things become personalized, and this is where you start to see people wearing headphones. The Walkman becomes popular. So it's stuff that we see today that is around everywhere today begins in the 1980s. The space program continues to grow in the 1980s and 1990s. You see the introduction of the space shuttle, which is a manned shuttle that can go into space and come back. You have the launch of the Hubble telescope. This is the most powerful telescope that was created, and it was launched into space as a satellite and was able to get images of distant galaxies of what you see there on the left, and brings back some really amazing pictures from space. And then you have the Voyager missions, which are launched to send objects out into interstellar space. And so these are really new programs for the space program. The space program continues to do great things in the 1980s and 1990s. You also begin to have minorities challenge traditional boundaries. In particular, you have an increasing number of African Americans and women on the Supreme Court. You have justices such as Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Clarence Thomas. So today we have several women and an African American on the Supreme Court. So before, where it used to just be white males, you now see these kind of boundaries being torn down. In the 1980s and increasing in the 1990s, women begin to enter the workforce more. They begin to leave those traditional family roles at home as the housewife, and they begin to take on non-traditional roles such as construction workers, as doctors. So there's more opportunity for women, and you see more households that have two people working. So if they have children, the husband and the wife will go to work rather than one staying at home. One of those non-traditional roles is women are serving in the military. In particular, women serve in combat in the U.S. military for the first time. Women serve in combat roles in the first Persian Gulf War, which is Operation Desert Storm, which lasted from 1990 to 1991, which was a war against Iraq, in Kuwait, and Iraq. And so women are entering non-traditional roles, in particular, serving in combat. In the 80s and 90s, you see an expansion of the middle class to where we saw in the 1950s, the middle class was pretty much white people. You have African Americans, you have Mexican Americans, you have other minorities who are able to have steady jobs, buy houses, and move into that middle class range. So let's finish up by looking at the presidents of the 1980s and 1990s. So in 1980, the governor of California, Ronald Reagan, is elected president of the United States. Reagan is a Republican. He becomes a conservative hero throughout the 1980s. One of the things he does is cut taxes. The idea is that less tax will help business grow. He wants to increase state government power. So that is, give more power to the state government in exchange for the federal government. So he reduces the size and scope of the national government. And one thing that Reagan does that's really significant is he strengthens the military. So what he's trying to do is face the Soviet Union in the Cold War. So he increases military spending. He comes up with new ideas for military strength. And so this really puts pressure on the Soviet Union. So again, Reagan is a Republican throughout the 1980s and is a conservative hero. In 1988, George H.W. Bush is elected president. Bush had been Reagan's vice president. So this is a continuation of the Reagan Revolution. This is also a continuation of Republican movement. So Reagan is a really popular president in the 80s. Republicans sweep Congress and state houses in the 1990s. This leads to, in a lot of ways, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe is seen as a victory of the Republicans. Reagan increased military spending. This put pressure on the Soviet Union and was one of the reasons that the Soviet Union falls apart. But under George Bush, you see the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. You see the breakup of the Soviet Union. You see the reunification of Germany. And you also have the beginning of a post-Cold War United States foreign policy, where the United States is the only superpower in the world. And so after the fall of the Soviet Union, George Bush authorizes troops to defend Kuwait in the Middle East from Iraq. And this is what's known as the Persian Gulf War of 1990 to 1991. And this is known as Operation Desert Storm. So what this represents is in this post-Cold War era, the United States will kind of defend other countries from aggression. So the United States, in a way, is becoming the world police under George Bush. Under George Bush, you see things that would be considered liberal today, that might have been considered even a little liberal at the time, pushed through under a Republican, under a conservative president. So you see the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 being passed, which protected Americans with disabilities. You see the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. So these are adding amendments to the EPA's initiative and trying to create better standards for clean air. So these are things that would have been seen as a liberal initiative that are being pushed forward under a Republican Congress, under a Republican president. However, George Bush loses the presidency in 1992 to Bill Clinton, who's a Democrat. Clinton does several things in the 1990s that really changed the way the United States functions. In particular, they passed the North American Free Trade Agreement. This allowed for free trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And what happens is this really leads to greater globalization, the United States relying on other countries for its economy. Clinton opens up diplomatic relations with Vietnam. So remember, the United States pretty much loses the Vietnam War. Clinton opens up relations with them. Clinton is the president when the USS Cole is attacked in 1997. The USS Cole was a warship that was off the coast of Somalia, was attacked by terrorist forces who we found out were Al Qaeda, who tied with Osama bin Laden. So this is one of the first attacks of Islamic terrorism against a U.S. asset. Clinton lifted economic sanctions against South Africa when apartheid ended. He reduced federal welfare spending, so trying to reduce the scope of the welfare state, but also opening up other guarantees for people, other programs, and such as increasing Medicare. And lastly, Clinton becomes the second president to ever be impeached because of a sex scandal. But while he's impeached in the House of Representatives, he is not removed from office. And so this becomes one of the major parts of the 1990s is Bill Clinton's personal life. And so you really start to see more and more of people. Again, this is when the generation, kind of the me decade, you begin to think that, hey, we should know more about the president's personal life. We should have more information about everything. And you have overall the 1980s and 1990s are really that kind of me decade. Things become more personalized. You have more electronics in your house. You have more entertainment options. And it's kind of more about you.